The morning sun broke over Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, casting long shadows across the parade ground. Major Sarah Chen stood at attention in her dress blues, her medals arranged perfectly across her chest, a silver star, two bronze stars, and a purple heart. Each one told a story of sacrifice. Each one represented blood, sweat, and tears. But nobody was looking at her medals. Captain James Holloway strutted toward her, his commanding officer's hat tilted just slightly too far back. He was new to the base, transferred in just 2 weeks earlier from a cushy desk job at the Pentagon. His uniform looked pressed to perfection, but it had never seen real combat. Sarah could tell by the way he walked, like he owned the ground beneath his feet without ever having had to fight for it. "Major Chen," he called out, loud enough for the nearby soldiers to hear, "I've got a real important question for you." Sarah kept her eyes forward, her jaw tight. She'd been in the Marine Corps for 18 years. She'd seen commanders come and go. She knew the drill: don't react, don't show emotion, maintain composure. Holloway circled her slowly, like a shark smelling blood in the water. "I was looking at your file this morning and I just couldn't figure something out. Maybe you can help me." He paused for effect. "What exactly is your rank supposed to be? Because looking at you, I'd say you look more like a sergeant, maybe a staff sergeant on a good day." A few soldiers nearby stopped what they were doing. Sarah felt their eyes on her. One young private actually looked at his boots, embarrassed for her. "My rank is Major, sir," Sarah said, her voice steady and professional. "Major Sarah Elizabeth Chen, United States Marine Corps." Holloway laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed across the parade ground. "Well, that's funny. I could have sworn majors were supposed to be intimidating." He gestured at her lean frame, her 5'6" height. Sarah was small, even by women's standards. Years of military service had kept her fit, but she would never be imposing just by looking at her. "You don't look like you could intimidate anybody, Chen. You look like you belong in an office with a computer, not leading men in the field." He turned to the soldiers watching. "Maybe that's why they stick you women in administrative roles, huh? You're just not built for real Marine work." Sarah's chest felt tight. The anger that rose in her was sharp and hot, but she forced it down. She'd learned to do this years ago. She'd learned to swallow the insults, the doubts, the casual dismissals of her service. She was one of only a handful of women who'd made it to the rank of major in the entire Marine Corps. Every step of the way, she'd faced comments like these. "Is that all, sir?" she asked, her voice smooth as ice. Holloway grinned, clearly pleased with himself. "Yeah, Chen, that's all for now." He walked away, still laughing to himself, already telling a couple of other officers what he'd said. Sarah stood there for a moment longer, her hands at her sides. Nobody said anything. That was the worst part. The silence. It meant everyone agreed, or at least no one was brave enough to disagree with their commanding officer. She turned and walked back toward the barracks, her face a perfect mask. But inside, something had shifted. Something inside Sarah had hardened just a little bit more. That night, sitting alone in her small apartment off base, Sarah pulled out her personal laptop. She didn't do this often. She tried to keep her work life and her private life separate, but tonight she needed something. Proof, evidence, a reminder that she wasn't crazy for feeling like she deserved better. She opened a secure folder on her computer, a folder that nobody else knew about. Inside were her service records, her mission reports, her commendations. More importantly, there were things that only she knew about. Things that had never made it into the official record because some situations were too sensitive, too classified to put in standard military files. She found the file marked Operation Silent Strike. Her hands hesitated on the keyboard for a moment. She hadn't opened this file in 3 years. Hadn't wanted to. The memories were still too raw. But she opened it anyway. Inside were photographs, encrypted reports, and mission details that would have made a general's eyes go wide. The operation had taken place in Yemen, in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. It had been a rescue mission, extracting an undercover CIA operative who'd been captured by a terrorist cell. The official story was that a team of Marines had successfully extracted the operative through conventional means. The truth was far more complicated. Sarah had been part of a specialized unit then, a unit so small and so secret that their existence wasn't acknowledged by the Department of Defense. They'd been trained in black operations, in situations where the usual rules didn't apply. And Sarah, despite her size and despite the doubters, had been one of their best operatives. She was the one they sent when they needed someone who could move through darkness without being seen. She was the one they called when precision and silence mattered more than raw strength. The other members of her unit had given her a nickname, Silent Reaper. She'd taken down hostile targets, gathered intelligence, and completed missions that most soldiers would never know existed. Nobody at Camp Lejeune knew about this. Her files showed her as a regular officer with commendations for valor. Nobody knew about the 37 confirmed kills, the intelligence missions across the Middle East, or the time she'd single-handedly extracted 3 American soldiers from a facility in Syria. Sarah closed the laptop. Captain Holloway didn't know who he was insulting. Nobody at Camp Lejeune did. They just saw a small, quiet woman who happened to be a major. They didn't see the scars underneath her uniform. They didn't know about the nightmares or the ghosts she carried from operations they would never hear about. Sarah had made a choice years ago to leave that world behind. She'd requested a desk job, a chance at something normal. She'd wanted to settle down, to help train the next generation of Marines, to prove that you could be effective and human at the same time. She'd wanted to move past the darkness. But watching Captain Holloway laugh at her, watching the other soldiers turn their eyes away rather than defend her, that darkness started calling again. She thought about how easy it would be to pick up the phone, to call certain people, to let them know exactly what Captain Holloway was up to make his life very complicated very quickly. Sarah sat there in the darkness of her apartment, staring at her laptop screen. For the first time in years, she felt the old hunger returning, not for violence, for justice, for a way to make people understand that you don't insult someone you don't really know. You don't dismiss the accomplishments of others just because they don't fit your idea of what strength looks like. Tomorrow, she would go back to work and smile and act like nothing had happened. That's what she'd always done. That's what women in the military learn to do. You push through the disrespect, you prove yourself through your work, you make it to the next rank, and hope that the next commanding officer will treat you with basic decency. But tonight, in the darkness of her apartment, Major Sarah Chen was remembering who she used to be, and she was wondering if it was time to remind everyone else. Outside her window, the North Carolina night was cool and quiet. In the distance, she could hear the sound of the ocean. Sarah had always loved the ocean. It was one of the reasons she'd fallen in love with the Marines. It represented freedom, power, and endless possibility. She didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change forever. And it would start with a single decision, a choice to stop letting people like Captain James Holloway control the narrative of her life. The Silent Reaper was about to wake up, and when she did, Camp Lejeune would never be the same. 3 days passed. 3 days of Sarah watching Captain Holloway strut around Camp Lejeune like he owned the place, making more comments, more jokes at the expense of his female officers. She watched him demote a lieutenant colonel's suggestion in a strategy meeting simply because she was a woman. She saw him laugh when a young female ensign spilled coffee on herself, mocking her for being clumsy. Each moment added to the weight pressing down on her chest. The military was supposed to be changing. The Department of Defense had been making efforts to be more inclusive, more fair. But real change was slow. Real change required people to actually care about treating others with respect. Captain Holloway didn't care. He belonged to an old guard that believed the military should be exclusive, and any woman in uniform was somehow diminishing that exclusivity. On the 4th day, Sarah did something she hadn't done in years. She made a phone call. The number she dialed wasn't listed anywhere. It went through encrypted servers and routing systems that would take the CIA days to trace if they ever got suspicious enough to look. 2 rings, then a voice, older, gravelly, steady. "Yeah." "Hello, Marcus," Sarah said quietly. Silence on the other end. Then, "Sarah, is that you?" "It's me." Damn, she could hear him shifting, moving away from wherever he was. Marcus Hollins had been her commanding officer during her time in the Black Ops unit. He was retired now, living somewhere out in the Pacific Northwest, officially removed from military life. Unofficially, he was still connected to certain networks, certain people. How long has it been? 3 years and 4 months, Sarah said. She knew the exact number of days too, but she didn't say that. Since Operation Silent Strike. Right, yeah, you sounded good back then. You sound different now. I need information, Sarah said. She could hear him breathing on the other end. She knew what he was thinking. Sarah Chen had called him out of the blue and she was asking for information. That meant something had happened. On a Captain James Holloway, transferred to Camp Lejeune from the Pentagon 2 weeks ago. Sarah, Please, Marcus, I just need to know if there's anything in his file, anything irregular. Another pause, then, hold on, let me make some calls. I'll ring you back in an hour. The call ended. Sarah sat at her desk, staring out the window at the parade ground where it had all started. Soldiers marched in formation, their boots hitting the ground in perfect rhythm. She'd always found that sound comforting. The discipline, the order, the proof that humans could work together toward something greater than themselves. Her phone buzzed exactly 58 minutes later. Found some interesting stuff, Marcus said without preamble. Your Captain Holloway has a pattern. He's been at 4 different military bases in the last 6 years. Never spent more than a year and a half at any of them. According to the scuttlebutt, there were always complaints filed after he left. 3 of the 4 times, women filed sexual harassment claims. The 4th time, a male subordinate filed for hostile work environment. Sarah's jaw clenched. Any consequences? You know how it works, Sarah. Consequences require action, and action requires someone to care enough to push it through. Holloway's file says he transferred for personal reasons each time. The complaints were marked resolved without any actual resolution being documented. How is that possible? It's possible because the system is broken, and people like Holloway know exactly how broken it is. He's got a mentor somewhere, someone with pull, someone who keeps moving him along before any real damage can be done to his career. Sarah thanked him and ended the call, but Marcus's words stayed with her. The system was broken. The system would protect someone like Holloway. The system would never hold him accountable for his behavior. That was the night Sarah started really working. She called in a few favors from old contacts. She accessed files that she wasn't supposed to access anymore. She built a profile on Captain James Holloway, not just his official military record, but everything else. His family connections, his financial records, his digital footprint. What she found was worse than she'd expected. Holloway's mentor was a 2-star general named David Sinclair, who'd been involved in several scandals himself, scandals that never went public. Sinclair had a way of making problems disappear, not by solving them, by simply moving the problem somewhere else, letting it become someone else's headache. But there was something else, something that made Sarah's blood run cold. Holloway had been dating a young Marine sergeant named Rebecca Hastings for the last several months. Sarah found old messages between them on an unsecured server, messages that suggested the relationship wasn't entirely consensual. There were hints of coercion, implications that Rebecca had been threatened with a negative performance review if she ended things. Sarah spent a whole night going through classified records, piece by piece, slowly building a case that would have taken a formal investigation months to assemble. By the time the sun came up, she had enough documentation to sink Captain Holloway's career. More than enough. But she didn't go to the Inspector General's office. She didn't file a complaint. Instead, she did something else. She created a document, not official, not filed anywhere in the system, just a straightforward report of facts with sources clearly documented. Everything Captain Holloway had done, everyone he'd hurt, every rule he'd bent, every system he'd manipulated. Then she sent it to every major news outlet that covered military scandals. She sent it to the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office. She sent it to the Army Times, the Navy Times, and every other publication that military families actually read. She sent it anonymously, but she made sure the documentation was solid enough that anyone could verify it themselves. The evidence wasn't classified. It was just organized, connected, made understandable for someone who didn't have access to military databases. Within 24 hours, the first story broke online. Pentagon official transferred after multiple sexual harassment allegations, the headline read. Within 48 hours, it was on cable news. Within 72 hours, General David Sinclair had been forced to resign pending an investigation. Captain James Holloway's transfer request came through on the 4th day. He was being reassigned to a desk job in Hawaii, essentially removed from any position of authority. His career trajectory had been permanently altered. And on the morning of the 5th day, Sarah sat in her office, watching him pack his things from across the base. She saw the slump in his shoulders. She saw him stop and look in her direction once, not knowing that she was watching him. She didn't feel satisfied. That was what surprised her most. She'd expected to feel powerful, vindicated, justified. Instead, she felt tired. She felt the weight of what she'd done pressing down on her like a physical thing. A knock on her open door made her turn. It was Rebecca Hastings, the young sergeant. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was something else in her expression, something like relief. "I heard what you did," Rebecca said quietly. "I don't know how you did it, but I heard. They're looking into everything now, everything." Sarah stood up. "I just organized some facts. You did the hard part, you spoke up even when it was scary." "I didn't speak up, Major. I was too afraid." "Then you're speaking up now," Sarah said gently. "That counts, that matters." After Rebecca left, Sarah sat back down. She pulled up her email and saw there was a new message. It was from an unknown sender, encrypted. She opened it. "Interesting work, Silent Reaper. Thought you were out of the game. We need to talk about coming back in. Specifically, we need someone like you to handle a situation in the Caucasus region. Consider it. M." Sarah deleted the message without responding. She wanted to move on. She wanted to be the person who helped Rebecca Hastings feel safe, not the person who orchestrated destruction from the shadows. But as she sat there, watching the sun set over Camp Lejeune, she knew something. She knew that Captain Holloway had been just the beginning. She knew that there were more like him. More predators, more corrupt officers, more people who'd figured out how to game the system. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that the world of military justice had just become much smaller. Because now there was someone who knew how to navigate it, someone with skills that could never officially be acknowledged, but that could make a very real difference. Sarah Chen had woken something up inside herself. And while she didn't want to be the Silent Reaper anymore, she also couldn't ignore what she was capable of when people around her were being hurt. Her phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. "Thank you, R." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. This time it wasn't about vengeance, it was about justice, and somehow that made it feel different. Life didn't go back to normal after Captain Holloway left. In fact, things at Camp Lejeune got more complicated, not less. The investigation into his conduct expanded. Reporters started digging deeper. Questions were asked about how someone with multiple harassment complaints could have been transferred through the system so easily. The Pentagon launched an official review. General Sinclair's retirement was put on hold pending charges. And somehow people knew, not officially, not through any announcement, but rumors spread through the military grapevine like wildfire. There was a story about a major at Camp Lejeune, a woman who'd brought down a corrupt command structure by simply organizing the truth. The details were vague, the names were protected, but the message was clear: corruption wasn't being tolerated anymore. Sarah tried to ignore the attention. She went to work, she trained junior officers, she attended meetings and filed reports. She wanted to be invisible, but invisibility was becoming harder and harder to achieve. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Holloway's transfer, Sarah was called into her own commanding officer's office. Colonel Margaret Foster was a woman who'd carved her own path through the male-dominated military, and she had a reputation for fairness and integrity. Sarah respected her deeply. "Close the door," Colonel Foster said, not looking up from the paper on her desk. Sarah did. The office was sparse, professional, decorated with commendations and photographs from Foster's 30-year career. The colonel finally looked up, and Sarah saw something in her expression that made her nervous. "I want you to listen to me very carefully," Foster said. "And I want you to answer me honestly. Did you have anything to do with the Holloway situation?" Sarah's first instinct was to deny it. She'd been trained to never admit to anything that couldn't be officially documented. But Colonel Foster's eyes held hers, and Sarah found she couldn't lie. Not to this woman, not about this. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said quietly. "I compiled information that was already available and made it accessible to the media." Foster nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something she'd already suspected. "The Pentagon wants you brought up on charges. Unauthorized disclosure of official records, violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, improper use of classified access." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Ma'am." "Let me finish," Foster said, holding up a hand. "I told them no. Ma'am, I told them that if they pressed charges against you, I would go public with everything I know about how this institution has repeatedly failed its female officers. I told them that you didn't disclose anything actually classified, and that the information you used was already part of official records. I told them that making an example out of you for exposing corruption would be the worst possible PR nightmare they could imagine." Foster leaned back in her chair. They backed down, you're not being charged. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. Thank you, Colonel. Don't thank me yet, Foster said. Because we both know this isn't over. You proved something to a lot of people, that the system can be changed if someone knows how to work it. And now you've got attention, the wrong kind of attention. People are going to be watching you more closely now. I just wanted to help Rebecca. I know, and you did. Rebecca Hastings filed a formal complaint yesterday. She's being connected with a civilian attorney who specializes in military harassment cases. She's going to be okay. Foster paused. But Sarah, you need to understand something. What you did was effective, but it was also risky. What happens the next time someone asks you to do something like that? It was a good question. Sarah had been asking herself the same thing. The next time, Foster continued, the Pentagon might not be so quick to back down. You could lose your career. You could lose your freedom. You need to think about what you're willing to sacrifice. After Sarah left the colonel's office, she walked the grounds of Camp Lejeune, her mind spinning. She thought exposing Holloway would close a chapter. Instead, it had opened something else. She'd shown people what was possible. She'd shown them what one person with access and determination could accomplish. That evening, she started getting emails. The first one was from a master sergeant named David Chen, no relation. He was being pressured to falsify maintenance records on aircraft for a colonel who wanted to hide safety violations. Would Sarah be interested in looking into it? The second email came from a doctor at the base hospital. She'd reported suspicious prescribing patterns from a naval officer, specifically, large quantities of controlled substances being distributed to people who had no medical need for them. The matter had been buried. Could Sarah help? The third email was from someone anonymously. It contained documentation of a sex trafficking ring operating from a base in Germany, involving active-duty military personnel and civilians. The investigation had been shut down by higher-ranking officers who had financial ties to the operation. Sarah read that last one 3 times. Sex trafficking. Actual human exploitation, not just harassment or corruption, but something that was actively destroying lives. She closed her laptop. She walked to her window and looked out at the sun setting over the water. The ocean had always been her anchor. It represented freedom, but also the weight of responsibility. The endless waves represented the endless problems that needed fixing. She thought about what Colonel Foster had said. What happens next time? When would she know to say no? When would she decide that the risks were too great? But she already knew the answer. She would keep going, because that's who she was. Whether she wanted to be or not, whether it was safe or not, Sarah Chen was someone who couldn't ignore injustice when she could do something about it. She picked up her phone and dialed Marcus again. "I'm back in," she said when he answered. "Or at least I'm back in enough. I need to know how to verify that information about the trafficking ring in Germany. I need to know if it's real." "Sarah," Marcus said carefully, "that's not the kind of work you do on your own time from a military base. That's the kind of work that gets people disappeared." "I'm not asking for your blessing, Marcus. I'm asking for your help." He sighed. "I know, that's what makes this so complicated." But she could hear him typing on the other end of the call. "Give me an hour. I'll send you information on how to verify the authenticity of those documents. But Sarah, be careful. This is different from exposing Holloway. This is going against people with real power, international power." "I know." "Do you?" Marcus asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're about to walk into something that's going to change your life in ways you can't predict." After they hung up, Sarah sat in the darkness of her apartment. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the base settling down for the night. Soldiers going to the barracks, officers heading home. The whole vast machinery of the military, grinding along, mostly good people doing good work, with pockets of corruption that nobody wanted to address. She thought about Rebecca Hastings, and how frightened and alone Rebecca must have felt, trapped with a predator who had institutional power over her. She thought about the master sergeant with the falsified records, knowing that planes with safety issues were going to fly, and people were going to trust those planes with their lives. She thought about people being trafficked, being sold, being used, with military personnel looking the other way for a cut of the profit. And she thought about herself, about the person she'd been before, about the Silent Reaper, about the skills that she'd thought she'd left behind. Marcus had been right about one thing. This was going to change her life. By morning, Sarah Chen would make a decision that would set her on a path she couldn't unchoose. she would become a hunter again. But this time, not hunting enemies on foreign soil. This time, hunting corruption in her own backyard. This time, hunting monsters that wore the same uniform she wore. The only difference between the silent reaper of the past and the person she was becoming now was that this time, she wasn't following orders. This time, she was making her own choices. This time, she was doing it for justice. And this time, she wouldn't be working alone. Over the next 3 months, Sarah became someone else. Not completely. She still went to work as Major Sarah Chen. She still attended meetings and filed reports. But in her off hours, in the secured spaces of her apartment and through encrypted communication channels that she dusted off from her old life, she became something different. She became a collector of truth. The master sergeant with the aircraft maintenance records became her first recruit. David Chen, the other David, was a good man with strong principles who'd been terrified to stand alone against the corrupt officers above him. When Sarah approached him, offering protection and resources, he broke down and gave her everything. Documents, recordings, email chains. Within days, she'd built an ironclad case. But instead of immediately going public this time, Sarah was learning. She was being strategic. She connected David with an inspector general investigator who owed Marcus a favor. The IG office opened a formal investigation. Sarah stayed in the shadows, providing information only when it was needed to keep things moving forward. The second case was more complicated. The doctor at the hospital, Dr. Patricia Walsh, had evidence of a controlled substance theft ring. But the deeper Sarah dug, the more people she discovered were involved. It wasn't just one corrupt officer. It was a network. And at the center of that network was a 3-star admiral named Richard Blackwood, who had his fingers in defense contracts, pharmaceutical kickbacks, and money laundering schemes that reached far beyond the military. Sarah realized she was in over her head. This wasn't something she could handle from her apartment, working at night. This was something that required professional help. That's when she made the call to the FBI. She didn't walk into a field office. That would have been too visible. Instead, she used contacts that Marcus provided, retired agents who'd gone into private security, people who still had connections inside the bureau. Through careful intermediaries, she arranged a meeting with a special agent named Lisa Reeves, who worked in the FBI's Public Corruption and Financial Crimes Division. They met in a civilian coffee shop in Jacksonville, not far from the base. Sarah had chosen the location carefully, public enough to be safe, but busy enough that nobody would pay attention to 2 women having coffee. Agent Reeves was in her late 40s with the sharp eyes of someone who'd seen too much of human nature's darker side. She listened while Sarah explained what she'd found. She didn't interrupt. She didn't look skeptical. She just listened and took notes. When Sarah finished, Reeves closed her notebook and sat back in her chair. "This is substantial," she said quietly. "If even half of this is verifiable, Admiral Blackwood is going down. And if Blackwood goes down, the people above him are going to start throwing each other under the bus to save themselves." "That's what I'm hoping for," Sarah said. "There's a problem, though," Reeves continued. "Once the FBI gets involved, I can't shield you anymore. You'll be a witness in a federal investigation. You'll be exposed." "I understand that." Reeves studied her carefully. "Do you understand what happens when powerful people know that you've destroyed them? They have long memories. They have long reach. The military is a small community. If you do this, you're going to have enemies, real ones, not just people who don't like you." "I know," Sarah said. "I just need you to promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Promise me that you'll follow the evidence wherever it goes. No matter how high it goes. No matter who it implicates. Promise me that this isn't going to be a show investigation where you pretend to look into it and then quietly close the case because the person involved is too powerful." Reeves set down her coffee cup. "I promise you that. If it comes out that I buried evidence of corruption at the admiral's level, my career is over. I've got nothing to gain from being dishonest about this." "Okay then," Sarah said, "I'm in." That conversation started an avalanche that Sarah couldn't have stopped even if she'd wanted to. Agent Reeves and the FBI began a full-scale investigation into Admiral Blackwood. They brought in the DEA to look at the controlled substance angle. They brought in the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. They contacted financial crimes units in 3 different states. And Sarah, despite her desire to stay hidden, became central to the investigation. She was the one who understood the military structure, who could interpret the documents, who could connect the dots in ways that civilian investigators couldn't immediately see. The investigation took another month, then another. Sarah lived a strange double life. By day, she was a military officer doing her job. By night, she was working with federal investigators, building a case that would reshape the landscape of military leadership. During this time, she had dinner with Colonel Foster twice. The colonel never asked directly about what Sarah was doing, but she made sure to let her know that she had her back. That if anyone at the base started making noise about Sarah's loyalty or asking too many questions about her activities, Foster would protect her. "What you're doing is important," Foster told her over coffee in the officers' club. "But you're also putting a target on your back. People need to know you're not doing this alone. They need to know you have institutional support." Sarah appreciated that more than she could express. The third case, the sex trafficking ring in Germany, moved more slowly. This wasn't something that the FBI could just investigate on American soil. This required coordination with NATO allies, with German law enforcement, with intelligence agencies. Sarah found herself connected to people she never thought she'd speak to again. She was consulting with people in the intelligence community who she'd worked with during her Black Ops days. One night, Marcus called her. "The Germans have taken over the trafficking investigation. They're making arrests now, military personnel and civilians both. It looks like your information was solid." "How many people?" Sarah asked. 47 so far, men and women across 3 countries, all connected to that trafficking ring. Sarah, you just helped shut down an international human trafficking operation." Sarah felt something in her chest tighten. 47 people. 47 people who'd been exploited, used, destroyed by a system that was supposed to protect them. And now, finally, someone was doing something about it. But she also knew something else. She knew that this was the end of her anonymity. By the time the German arrests were made public and connected back to the initial investigation, it would become clear that someone inside the military had provided the initial tip. Someone smart, someone with access, someone with the skills to piece together evidence across continents. The Pentagon would figure it out eventually. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. Sarah sat on her apartment balcony looking out at the ocean. The waves were rough tonight, churning and dark. That seemed right somehow. That seemed like the right soundtrack for what was about to happen. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Berlin operation successful. 47 victims liberated. Rest well, Silent Reaper. You've earned it. Valkyrie." Sarah recognized the name. Valkyrie was a code name used by intelligence operatives. The fact that someone was using it in a text to her was significant. It meant that word was spreading. It meant that people in the intelligence community knew what she'd done. It meant that Major Sarah Chen, the woman who was supposedly just a desk officer at Camp Lejeune, was becoming legendary. She didn't have much time left at the base. She could feel it. The Admiral Blackwood investigation was winding down. Arrests were coming. And when those arrests happened, people would connect the dots. They would figure out that Sarah was the source. The question was, what would they do about it? Would they try to protect her, recognizing that she'd done something important? Or would they try to silence her, punishing her for exposing corruption at levels they'd prefer to keep hidden? Sarah didn't know the answer yet, but she knew that her quiet life as a desk officer at Camp Lejeune was about to end. She knew that the decision she'd made 3 months ago, sitting alone in her apartment after the Holloway situation, was about to have consequences. She'd chosen to step out of the darkness and into the light. She'd chosen to be a voice for the voiceless, a hunter of corruption, a protector of the weak. She'd chosen to become more than just a soldier following orders. She'd chosen to become something greater. The only question now was, would the system that she'd served her entire life recognize the importance of what she'd done? Or would it try to destroy her for threatening the power structures that kept it running? The arrests happened on a Tuesday. Admiral Richard Blackwood was taken into custody at Andrews Air Force Base. 17 other military officers were arrested simultaneously across 5 different bases. 12 civilian contractors were picked up by the FBI in 5 states. The German government made their own arrests at the same time, ensuring that the entire network would be taken down in a coordinated operation. The news hit every network by noon. Military leadership accused of corruption, drug trafficking, and sex trafficking ring, the headlines read. The story exploded across conservative news outlets, liberal news outlets, international media. It was too big, too important to be buried or quietly contained. And Sarah knew that it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots back to her. She was in a meeting with Colonel Foster when the Pentagon called. Foster took the call privately in her office, and Sarah could hear the tension rising in her voice even through the closed door. When the colonel emerged, her face was grim. "The Pentagon wants you in Washington. Tomorrow. They're launching an official inquiry into the investigation, and they want to talk to you about your involvement." Sarah's heart was pounding, but her voice stayed calm. "Am I being charged with anything?" "Not yet," Foster said carefully. "But don't go alone. Get yourself a lawyer, the kind who specializes in military law." That evening, Sarah called Marcus again. "I need to know what I'm walking into," she said. "Is this about protecting me or destroying me?" "Both," Marcus said. "There are people in the Pentagon who want you decorated for what you've done. They're the ones pushing back against the pressure from the higher-ups who want you made an example of. Right now, it's a fight. And honestly, Sarah, it could go either way. But the cases are solid, right? The evidence is real." "Completely solid. Admiral Blackwood is going to prison. So are his co-conspirators. This investigation is going to shake the Department of Defense to its core. You did exactly what you set out to do. You exposed corruption, and you're going to help save lives in the process." "So why do I feel like I'm about to be sacrificed?" "Because power doesn't like being challenged," Marcus said. "And you challenged power at levels that most people don't have the courage to even acknowledge exist." The next morning, Sarah put on her dress blues. She'd had them cleaned after the Holloway situation when she'd last worn them at an official function. She pinned her medals across her chest, the silver star, the bronze stars, the purple heart. Each one a reminder of who she was and what she'd sacrificed. The drive to Washington took 10 hours. Sarah had hired a military law specialist named David Rothstein, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a reputation for defending officers who'd been caught between institutional pressure and their own conscience. He sat beside her in the car, reading through documents and making notes. "You're in an interesting position," Rothstein said without looking up. "Usually when someone exposes this level of corruption, they're either a hero or a fall guy, rarely both at the same time." "Which am I going to be?" Sarah asked. "That depends on which side of the political spectrum wins the argument in the Pentagon today," Rothstein said. "There's a segment of military leadership that's been wanting to clean house for years. They see your actions as an opportunity. There's another segment that's terrified about what other investigations might be opened if this is allowed to stand. They see you as a threat." The Pentagon meeting took place in a conference room with a view of Arlington Cemetery. 7 admirals and generals sat across from Sarah and Rothstein. The conversation was formal, professional, and emotionally distant. They asked her questions. They asked her to verify timelines. They asked her to explain her methodology. Sarah answered everything directly and completely. She didn't apologize. She didn't express doubt about her actions. She'd done what was right, and she wasn't going to apologize for it. After 3 hours, the senior admiral, Admiral Patricia Morrison, the first woman to achieve 4-star rank, told Sarah and Rothstein to step out of the room. They waited in the hallway for 45 minutes. When they were called back in, the tone of the meeting had changed. Admiral Morrison spoke directly to Sarah. "The Department of Defense has determined that while your methods were unorthodox, and in some cases technically violated protocol, your actions resulted in the exposure of significant corruption that would have otherwise remained hidden," Morrison said. "The evidence you gathered has been thoroughly verified by multiple agencies. Admiral Blackwood and his co-conspirators are guilty of serious crimes. The trafficking victims are being rescued. 47 lives have been saved." She paused. "The Marine Corps does not officially acknowledge unofficial investigations. However, we do recognize when officers go above and beyond in service to something greater than themselves." Morrison stood up. "Major Sarah Chen, you are hereby promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Additionally, you will be reassigned to the Pentagon's Office of Inspector General, where you will head a new division dedicated to rooting out corruption within military ranks. This position comes with appropriate clearance for the sensitive nature of the work." Sarah felt her knees go weak. She'd been expecting them to either promote her or court-martial her. She wasn't expecting both outcomes to somehow merge into something else. There is one condition, Admiral Morrison continued. The methods you used to gather evidence cannot be repeated. Any future investigations will be conducted through official channels, with proper documentation and appropriate oversight. Your role will be to help establish protocols that prevent corruption from reaching the levels we saw with Admiral Blackwood. You will not be operating independently. You will have a team, oversight, and strict guidelines about what you can and cannot do. Yes, ma'am, Sarah said. One other thing, Morrison said. We'll be keeping your previous service record where it belongs, classified. Your promotion to Lieutenant Colonel, your new assignment, that's all public record. But the Silent Reaper years stay buried. Understood? Yes, ma'am, Sarah said again. She understood perfectly. The Pentagon was giving her legitimacy, but they were also containing her. They were saying, you've proven your value, but now you work for us and you work within our rules. It was a compromise. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than Sarah had dared hope for. The drive back to North Carolina took the same 10 hours, but somehow it felt different. Sarah was quiet most of the way, processing what had happened. She was no longer Major Chen, the desk officer. She was Lieutenant Colonel Chen, the head of an anti-corruption task force. She was being legitimized. She was being brought into the fold. When she got back to Camp Lejeune, she found a surprise waiting for her. Colonel Foster had organized a small gathering of officers from the base. When Sarah walked into the conference room, she was greeted with applause. Genuine, warm, respectful applause. Rebecca Hastings was there too, looking stronger than Sarah had ever seen her. Rebecca had since been assigned to a different unit, away from the toxic environment that had kept her trapped. She was smiling. Thank you, Rebecca said simply, when she got a moment alone with Sarah. Thank you for not forgetting about me. Thank you for being brave enough to stand up. You stood up too, Sarah said. You filed the complaint, you told the truth. I just organized what was already there. No, Rebecca said. You did more than that. You showed me that there are people in this military who care about doing the right thing, that there's hope. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Sarah packed up her apartment. She said goodbye to the officers who'd become her friends at Camp Lejeune. She prepared for her new life in Washington. But before she left, she did one final thing. She sent an email to everyone, Captain Holloway, General Sinclair, everyone who'd doubted her, everyone who'd made her feel small. She didn't send it to insult them. She sent it with one simple message. I was never just a desk officer. I was never just a small woman who didn't look like she belonged in the military. I was a Marine, and Marines never quit. Thank you for reminding me who I was. She never got a response from any of them. She didn't expect to. 6 months later, Sarah Chen sat in her new office at the Pentagon. The window looked out on the building's inner courtyard, not the view she might have hoped for, but it was solid, permanent, real. She had a team of 12 officers, all of them carefully selected for their integrity and their commitment to exposing corruption. Her first major investigation was already underway. She discovered evidence of defense contracts being awarded to companies that had no legitimate qualification for the work, with kickbacks going to generals and contractors. It was systemic. It was deep. It was the kind of thing that could take years to unwind. But Sarah was patient. She had time. One day, she got a call from Agent Lisa Reeves at the FBI. I wanted you to know, Reeves said. We've been monitoring some chatter from people who are very unhappy about what you've been doing. People with serious power and serious reach. They're talking about making your life complicated. Let them, Sarah said. I know who I am now. I know what I'm capable of. Let them try. I'm serious, Reeves said. These aren't people you can out-investigate. These are people who might try something more direct. Then I guess we'd better make sure we finish our cases before they can act on that thought, Sarah said. She wasn't afraid. Fear was what had kept so many people silent for so long. Fear was the tool that corruption used to maintain power. Sarah had decided a long time ago that she wouldn't live in fear anymore. That night, Sarah stood on the balcony of her new apartment in Arlington, looking out toward Washington. The city glowed in the darkness, all power and ambition and possibility. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the insult from Captain Holloway that had seemed so small at the time, the decision to expose him, the discovery of corruption reaching so much higher than anyone had imagined. She thought about Rebecca Hastings, Rebecca, and the other trafficking victims. She thought about the 47 lives that had been saved because she'd decided to do the right thing, consequences be damned. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Watching your work at the Pentagon, impressive. If you ever want to come back to the field, there's a position available in Eastern Europe. No pressure, just an offer. M. Sarah smiled. Marcus was never going to stop trying to recruit her back into the Black Ops world, but she didn't need that anymore. She'd found her purpose, and it was here in the light, doing the work that needed to be done. She typed a response, "Thank you, but I'm exactly where I need to be." The truth was, Sarah Chen had become something more powerful than the Silent Reaper had ever been. She was no longer operating in shadows, following orders, carrying out missions that would never be acknowledged. She was a voice. She was a force for change within the institution itself. She was proof that one person, one brave person, could stand up to corruption and win, could stand up to insults and mockery and doubt and choose to be her best self anyway, could look at injustice and say, "Not on my watch." As she stood there on the balcony, watching the lights of Washington twinkle in the darkness, Sarah allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the peace of giving up, not the peace of quiet acceptance, but the peace of knowing that she'd made a difference, that she'd fought the good fight, that she'd chosen justice over revenge, integrity over self-preservation. The next morning, she would return to her office. There would be new cases to investigate, new corruption to expose, new lives to help. The work would never be finished. Corruption was like a weed, pull out one root system and another one would spring up somewhere else. But at least now someone was paying attention. At least now there was someone who would fight for what was right, regardless of the cost. And that made all the difference.